In the autumn of 1415, a small, exhausted English army, ravaged by dysentery and trapped on foreign soil, turned to face a colossal French force on a muddy field near the castle of Agincourt. The ensuing battle became a legend, a cornerstone of English national identity. It was the story of the underdog, of King Henry V and his happy few, who, through sheer courage and the devastating power of the longbow, achieved one of the most miraculous victories in military history. The official narrative, cemented by chroniclers and immortalized by Shakespeare, spoke of valor against overwhelming odds, of French arrogance humbled by English tenacity. But this glorious tale, so clean and inspiring, was a carefully constructed myth. The truth of what happened in that bloody, rain-soaked ploughland was far darker, more complex, and deliberately buried beneath layers of propaganda and national pride. It was a story not of a miracle, but of a meticulously planned execution, a secret hidden in plain sight, waiting for a key to turn in a lock that had been rusted shut for centuries. But 600 years later, in the quiet countryside of modern-day France, the renovation of an old stone barn would shatter the legend. A simple act of manual labor would unearth an anomaly, a single, forgotten object that would reopen the coldest of cases and force a reckoning with the ghosts of Agincourt. The accepted history was about to be put on trial, and the verdict would change everything. Dr. Alistair Finch considered the battlefield of Agincourt less a place of history and more a place of personal obsession. For him, a military historian whose career had been built on deconstructing the romantic myths of medieval warfare, Agincourt was the ultimate enigma. He stood on a small rise overlooking the now peaceful fields, the chill October wind whipping at his coat. The gentle slope of the land, the copses of trees marking the English flanks, it was all there, just as the chronicles described. Yet it never felt right. The numbers, the timing, the sheer scale of the French defeat, it defied simple explanations of mud and archery. The official story was that the French, laden with heavy plate armor, charged across a narrow, rain-sodden field, becoming bogged down and easy targets for the English longbowmen. It was a story of incompetence meeting fortitude. But Alistair's instincts, honed over 2 decades of poring over battlefield accounts and archaeological surveys, screamed that something was missing. There was a variable, an unknown factor that had been scrubbed from the record. His office at the university was a testament to this fixation, the walls covered in topographical maps, reproductions of medieval manuscripts, and diagrams illustrating arrow trajectories and armor penetration. His colleagues regarded his Agincourt obsession with a kind of weary affection. He was the man chasing a ghost in a settled argument. They saw a closed case. He saw a gaping wound in the historical narrative. He believed that history wasn't just written by the victors. It was meticulously edited, curated, and sanitized for public consumption. Henry V needed a miracle to legitimize his claim to the French throne, and his chroniclers had delivered one. Alistair was convinced the real story was one of brutal, cold calculation, not divine favor. As he stood there, watching the gray clouds scud across the sky, he had no idea that less than a mile away, the ghost he was chasing was about to be given a voice. In a barn that had stood since the 15th century, a French farmer named Luc Dubois was wrestling with a crowbar, trying to pry loose a stubborn foundation stone as part of a long-overdue renovation. The stone, part of an interior wall that had been sealed for as long as anyone could remember, finally gave way with a grinding crunch, revealing a dark, hollow space within. Dust, thick and ancient, billowed out. As it settled, Luke peered into the cavity, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. There, nestled amongst crumbling mortar and desiccated rat nests, was a small, dark object. It was a leather satchel, blackened with age, its flap sealed with a disc of dark, brittle wax bearing the faint impression of a royal seal. Luc Dubois was a man of the earth, not of letters. He knew the history of his land in the abstract. He knew a great battle had been fought here, that kings and knights had perished in the mud that still clung to his tractor tires. But this object felt different. It was a direct, tangible link to that violent past. With careful, calloused fingers, he lifted the satchel from its stone tomb. The leather was stiff and threatening to crack, but it had held. He carried it into the light of his workshop, the smell of ancient dust and decay filling the air. He broke the wax seal with his thumb, the brittle material crumbling into dark flakes. Inside, protected from the centuries of damp and cold, was a bundle of vellum sheets, tightly rolled and tied with a leather thong. Alongside it lay a single heavy piece of metal, a silver signet ring tarnished almost black, its face engraved with a coat of arms he didn't recognize, a swooping hawk over a chevron. The vellum was covered in dense, spidery script, written in a language he couldn't read, but he recognized the cadence of officialdom. This was not a personal letter. It felt important, dangerous even. Unsure of what to do, he contacted the small historical society in the nearby town of Agincourt. From there word spread. A medieval English military document found on the battlefield was a significant, if not unprecedented, discovery. The local museum curator, aware of the document's potential importance, made a series of calls. One of those calls was to the history department of a British university, asking for the foremost expert on the Agincourt campaign. The call was routed to Dr. Alistair Finch. When his phone rang, Alistair was deep in a manuscript, cross-referencing casualty lists. The initial report was tantalizing but vague. A satchel, some documents, a ring. He'd heard similar stories before, which usually turned out to be forgeries or misidentified later period items. His initial reaction was one of professional skepticism. But the mention of a wax-sealed satchel found inside a 15th-century wall piqued his interest. That suggested authenticity. When the curator emailed him a low-resolution photo of the script and the signet ring, his skepticism evaporated, replaced by a surge of adrenaline that was all too familiar. The script was unmistakably 15th-century English chancery hand. The ring was French heraldry. Why were they together? It was an anomaly, a piece that didn't fit. Within 24 hours, Alistair had booked a flight, his mind racing with possibilities. Was this the key? The missing piece of the puzzle he'd been searching for his entire academic life. As his plane descended towards France, he looked down at the patchwork of green and brown fields, the landscape that had held its secret for so long. The ghost of Agincourt was stirring, and Alistair was flying directly into its embrace. The village of Agincourt was quiet, almost reverent, the air thick with the weight of its own name. Alistair met Luc Dubois at the old farmhouse, the barn standing beside it like a silent stone sentinel. Luc, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and wind, led him to the spot, pointing to the hole in the wall with a quiet solemnity. "Here," he said in French. For 600 years it was waiting. Alistair, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, knelt and peered into the cavity, imagining the moment it was sealed, the reasons lost to time. In Luc's kitchen, on a simple wooden table, the artifacts were laid out on a clean cloth. The satchel, the vellum, the ring. Alistair put on a pair of archival gloves, his movements slow and deliberate. He picked up the ring first. The tarnish couldn't obscure the fine detail of the engraving. Chevron. He knew it would take time to identify, but it was undoubtedly the signet of a French nobleman. Then he turned to the documents. He carefully unrolled the vellum sheets. The main text, as he suspected, was a copy of the orders for the battle, detailing the placement of the archers and the men-at-arms. It was similar to other extant copies, a standard field order. But as his eyes scanned the margins, his breath caught in his throat. Scrawled alongside the formal script were annotations, written in a different, more hurried hand. The ink was slightly faded, the letters less precise, as if written by an older man or by someone writing quickly on an unstable surface. And the notes weren't just in English. They were a strange mix of Latin and what looked like a simple cipher. He could make out a few Latin words immediately. Cuneus, wedge. Fossa, ditch. Nulla misericordia, no mercy. The last phrase sent a chill down his spine. No mercy. It was a direct contradiction to the chivalric codes of the era, a brutal instruction that had no place in an official order. This was the anomaly. The official orders were the public face of the battle plan. These annotations were the secret heart. What was the cipher hiding? And whose hand had written these chilling additions? The most pressing question of all remained. Why was a set of secret English battle orders found sealed in a wall with the ring of a French nobleman? Suggested a connection, a transaction. Secret meeting. It pointed not to a battle, but to a conspiracy. Alistair looked up from the documents, his gaze meeting Luke's. The farmer saw the look on the historian's face, a flicker of dark discovery, of a terrible new understanding. The quiet field outside the window no longer seemed peaceful, felt like a crime scene. Alistair knew he was out of his depth with the annotations. While he could recognize the script and the smattering of Latin, the cipher and the specific characteristics of the handwriting required a specialist. He returned to England with high-resolution scans of the documents, leaving the originals in the care of the French authorities, and immediately contacted Dr. Elena Vance. Vance was a paleographer, a scholar of ancient handwriting, and one of the few people Alistair trusted implicitly. She worked in a quiet, book-lined office that smelled of old paper and leather-bound spines, a sanctuary of meticulous detail. He laid the images out on her large oak desk. She leaned over them, a magnifying glass in her hand, her expression one of intense concentration. "The main text is standard," she confirmed after a few minutes, her voice precise. "Royal clerk, probably written out at Harfleur before the march began. Professional, clean." She then moved her glass to the marginalia. Her brow furrowed. "But this is entirely different. The hand is older. See the slight tremor here. And the way the T is crossed. It's less formal, more pragmatic. The writer is educated, certainly, but this is the hand of a soldier or an administrator, not a scribe." While Elena worked on identifying the hand, Alistair focused on the cipher. It was, as he'd suspected, a simple substitution cipher, where each letter is replaced by another. It was a common enough method for low-level military secrecy, designed to confuse a cursory glance, not to withstand dedicated cryptanalysis. Working with Elena, they began the painstaking process of substitution. They identified common letter frequencies, tested patterns, and slowly, chillingly, the secret messages began to emerge from the gibberish. The first phrase they fully decoded sent a fresh wave of ice through Alistair's veins. "Channel the charge to the center." It was placed next to the section detailing the deployment of the archers on the flanks. The second was even more specific. "The stakes will break the line." This referred to the sharpened stakes the English archers famously planted in front of their positions. The traditional view was that they were a general deterrent. This note implied they had a specific tactical purpose: to shatter the coherence of a cavalry charge at a predetermined point. The most disturbing phrase came from the annotation next to Henry's orders for handling prisoners. The cipher, combined with the Latin nulla misericordia, translated to "signal for no quarter on the second charge." This was premeditated. The infamous order to kill the French prisoners, long debated by historians as a moment of battlefield panic by Henry V as the French second line advanced, was planned from the start. It wasn't a desperate measure. It was policy. The pieces were slotting together into a terrifying mosaic. This wasn't a battle plan. It was a blueprint for a trap. Killbox. The mud, the stakes, the rain. They weren't just factors the English exploited. They were elements of a carefully engineered slaughter. The annotations transformed the Battle of Agincourt from a feat of arms into an act of mass assassination. The signet ring was the other half of the equation. It was the link, the proof that this English plan had somehow involved a Frenchman. Alistair sent the high-resolution images of the ring's crest to a heraldry expert in Paris, a fussy, brilliant man named Dr. Jean-Paul Moreau. While he waited for the identification, Alistair plunged into the labyrinthine world of French noble genealogies from the period. He needed to know who the ring belonged to and, more importantly, why they might have been colluding with the English. The email from Moreau arrived 2 days later. The crest, a hawk over a chevron, belonged to the d'Agincourt family, a minor house from Picardy. Their lands were situated not far from the battlefield. Moreau's email included a brief summary. The d'Alincourts were vassals to the Duke of Orleans, a fierce enemy of the English. The family patriarch, Sire Guillaume d'Alincourt, and his 2 sons are listed as having fought and died at Agincourt. The line was extinguished. Extinguished. The word hung in the air. It was too neat. Alistair's intuition was firing on all cylinders. He felt that nagging sense of something being wrong, the same feeling he got when he looked at the battlefield. He started digging deeper, cross-referencing French and Burgundian chronicles, searching for any mention of the d'Alincourt name beyond the simple casualty lists. He found a footnote in a dusty regional history, a throwaway line about a long-running and bitter land dispute between the d'Alincourts and a more powerful neighboring family, the de Valois, who were closely allied with the French constable, Charles d'Albret, the co-commander of the French army at Agincourt. A motive began to crystallize in Alistair's mind, ugly and all too human. What if Sire d'Alincourt wasn't a loyal Frenchman? What if he was a desperate man, squeezed by his powerful neighbors and ignored by his own liege lord? What if the English offered him a deal? Help us, and when we are masters of France, your lands and titles will be restored, and your rivals will be ruined. It was a classic gambit of espionage. d'Alincourt could have provided the English with crucial intelligence, the French commanders' plans, their arguments, their overconfidence. He could have advised them on how to manipulate the arrogant French chivalry into charging precisely where the English wanted them to. The final damning piece of information came from a detailed analysis of the Agincourt roll, the official list of the French casualties. While Guillaume d'Alincourt and his sons were listed, a notation in the margin of one copy read, "Corpus non inventum, body not found." In the chaos of the battlefield, this wasn't entirely unusual. But combined with everything else, it was deeply suspicious. What if he wasn't found because he wasn't there to be found? What if he had slipped away, his betrayal complete, leaving his ring with his English handlers as a final token, or perhaps having it taken from him once his purpose was served? The forgotten victim was no longer a victim. He was a potential conspirator, a ghost who had shaped the course of the battle and then vanished from history. The identity of the French conspirator was one thing, but the identity of the English mastermind was another. Who had the authority, the audacity, and the cold-blooded pragmatism to write those annotations? Alistair considered King Henry V himself. The king was known to be a brilliant, hands-on commander. But Elena Vance was firm. The handwriting did not match the few known examples of Henry's script. This hand was older, shakier, but still ruthlessly firm. Alistair's mind began to cycle through the names of Henry's command staff. The Duke of York, who died in the battle. Unlikely. The Duke of Gloucester, Henry's younger brother. Too inexperienced. Then a name, long relegated to a ceremonial role in the popular histories, surfaced in his mind. Sir Thomas Erpingham. Erpingham was the quintessential old soldier. He was nearly 60 at the time of Agincourt, a veteran of countless campaigns in Wales, Scotland, and on the continent. In the chronicles, and most famously in Shakespeare's Henry V, he is portrayed as a loyal, grandfatherly figure, the one who gives the signal for the battle to begin by famously tossing his baton in the air and crying, "Now strike." He was the steady hand, the voice of experience. But Alistair knew that veteran soldiers of Erpingham's generation were not romantic figures. They were survivors. They were pragmatists who understood that war was not about chivalry but about killing the enemy as efficiently as possible. Alistair began to construct a new profile of Erpingham, not as a ceremonial figurehead, but as the hidden architect of the victory. While Henry was the charismatic leader, the inspirational king, Erpingham was the operational brain, the one tasked with turning the king's ambition into a bloody reality. He was the one old enough and ruthless enough to devise a plan that bordered on a war crime, a plan that would have to be concealed to protect the king's chivalric reputation. The image was forming. Erpingham meeting with the desperate Sire d'Alincourt in secret, perhaps in the very barn where the satchel was found. Erpingham, using d'Alincourt's intelligence to refine his trap. Erpingham, taking Henry's standard battle orders and, in the dim light of a campaign tent, scrawling his secret, deadly instructions in the margins. The hidden in plain sight culprit was no longer Henry V, the celebrated hero, but his most trusted, unassuming knight. The man history remembered for tossing a stick in the air was, in fact, the one who had designed the abattoir. Alistair knew he needed proof. A theory, however compelling, was not enough. He needed to find a direct link, a piece of Erpingham that would confess his role across the centuries. The hunt for Thomas Erpingham led Alistair to Norfolk, the heart of the old knight's power base. The Erpingham family estate was long gone, but its archives were preserved by a local heritage trust, housed in a chilly, climate-controlled vault beneath the Norwich City Library. The archivist, a prim woman named Mrs. Albright, was protective of Erpingham's legacy. To her, he was a local benefactor, the man who built the magnificent Erpingham Gate at the entrance to Norwich Cathedral, his statue still looking down on the city. She viewed Alistair's inquiry with thinly veiled suspicion. Sir Thomas was a hero, she stated, her tone leaving no room for debate. A pillar of the community and the kingdom. Alistair, unfazed, simply nodded and requested access to the 15th-century estate records. For 3 days, he sat in the silent, sterile reading room, surrounded by the ghosts of the past. He sifted through brittle land deeds, agricultural accounts, and family correspondence, the dry, formulaic language of medieval bureaucracy revealing little. There was no smoking gun, no diary detailing a conspiracy. He was about to give up, concluding that Erpingham had been too careful, too thorough in covering his tracks. Then he found it. It wasn't a confession, but it was an anomaly, another piece that didn't fit. In the estate's financial ledgers for the year 1416, there was a large, unusual expenditure. A payment of £50, a small fortune at the time, was made to the Abbey of St. Bertin in St. Omer, a monastery in France not far from Agincourt. The ledger entry was vague, stating only that the funds were for the establishment of a chantry, a fund for monks to say prayers in perpetuity. The reason given was pro anima perdita, for a lost soul. It was cryptic and deeply strange. Why would Erpingham, a man from Norfolk, endow a perpetual prayer service in a minor French abbey for an anonymous lost soul? Unless that soul was lost in a service known only to him. The lost soul of Sire de Agincourt, the traitor he had used and perhaps disposed of? It was circumstantial, but powerfully suggestive. The final piece of the puzzle came late on the 3rd day. Buried in a box of miscellaneous family papers was a draft of a letter, written in a hand that Alistair now knew almost intimately. It was Erpingham's, older, shakier, but unmistakable. It was a draft to his wife Alice, written in Calais in the days following the battle. The final sent version had not survived, but this raw, unedited draft was a window into the old knight's soul. He wrote of his weariness, the terrible cost of the victory. And then one sentence, crossed out but still legible, jumped off the page. We have paid a terrible price for England's safety, and a necessary sin weighs upon my soul. Pray for the French sparrow who flew too close to our flame and was consumed by it. A French sparrow. Consumed by the flame of the English army. This was it. This was the confession. Not a legal document, but a moment of private anguish from the man who had orchestrated the entire affair. The sparrow was de Agincourt. The necessary sin was the trap. The lost soul was the traitor whose ghost he was now paying to have prayed for, hoping to buy peace for a conscience stained by a victory far too complete. Alistair now had a complete, unbroken chain of evidence. It began with a satchel and a ring found in a barn wall, and ended with a crossed-out line in a 600-year-old letter. He could reconstruct the entire hidden history of the Battle of Agincourt. The misleading narrative of a simple underdog victory was a lie, crafted to build the legend of Henry V. The truth was an unveiling of modern ruthless warfare tactics disguised by the trappings of chivalry. The architect was Sir Thomas Erpingham, a man who saw the world not in terms of honor but in terms of grim necessity. He had identified a weakness in the French command, a desperate, aggrieved nobleman named Sire de l'Agincourt. He cultivated him as an asset, promising him the restoration of his family's honor in exchange for vital intelligence. De l'Agincourt, the French sparrow, told Erpingham everything. The divisions in the French camp, the arrogance of the senior commanders, their absolute determination to charge the English head-on, regardless of the terrain. Armed with this intelligence, Erpingham didn't just prepare for a battle. He designed a kill zone. The reinterpreted ground-penetrating radar scans, once thought to show random ditches, now revealed a deliberate, subtle funnel, designed to channel the French charge into a compressed, chaotic mass. The sharpened stakes weren't just a defensive wall. They were placed at the precise point where the funnel was narrowest, intended to trip the lead horses and create a horrific pileup of men and animals. The English archers, masters of their craft, were then instructed to pour arrows into this writhing, helpless mass of French chivalry. The no-quarter signal wasn't a moment of panic. It was the final, brutal step in the plan. Erpingham knew that a wounded French knight was a future threat, and a captive was a logistical burden. The order to kill the prisoners was a cold, calculated decision made before the first arrow ever flew, a necessary sin to ensure the English army's survival and the totality of their victory. The body of Sire de l'Agincourt was never found because Erpingham had likely ensured his silence, leaving behind only his signet ring as a token of a dark pact, a pact that was then sealed, along with the damning battle orders, inside the wall of the barn where they had met. The story was complete, horrifying, and it overturned one of the most cherished myths in English history. The setting for the climax was the annual Royal Historical Society Conference, a grand event held in a centuries-old London hall. The air was thick with academic prestige and the quiet rustle of notepads. Alistair Finch, a relative outsider known for his maverick theories, was the final speaker of the day. The title of his presentation was deliberately provocative: The Erpingham Stratagem, Re-evaluating Agincourt. In the front row sat the titans of the field, including Professor Harold Carlyle, the world's leading authority on Henry V, a man who had dedicated 50 years to polishing the king's heroic legend. Alistair began calmly, methodically. He started with the established narrative, the story everyone in the room knew by heart. Then he introduced the catalyst. The discovery in the French barn. A picture of the satchel and ring appeared on the screen behind him. A murmur went through the audience. He then walked them through the investigation, step by painstaking step. The paleographic analysis of the annotations. The breaking of the cipher. The chilling phrases. Funnel the charge. No quarter. He presented the genealogical research on the de l'Agincourt family, their land dispute, the missing body. He showed them the heraldic proof from the ring. He then moved to Erpingham. He displayed the Norfolk archive records, the payment to the French abbey for a lost soul. The tension in the room was palpable, a mixture of shock and deep-seated skepticism. The final slide was a high-resolution image of Erpingham's draft letter. Alistair read the crossed-out line aloud. "Pray for the French sparrow who flew too close to our flame and was consumed by it." A collective gasp went through the hall. He had them. He had connected the spy, the plan, and the mastermind. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alistair concluded, his voice resonating with conviction, the Battle of Agincourt was not a miracle. It was a masterpiece of intelligence, deception, and brutality. It was a trap, engineered by the man history has dismissed as a ceremonial figure. The hero of the story is not just Henry V, but the cold, pragmatic mind of his master of war, Sir Thomas Erpingham, who committed a necessary sin to save his king and his country, and then buried the truth so completely that it has taken us 600 years to find it. As he finished, there was a moment of stunned silence before the room erupted. During the heated Q&A, Professor Carlyle rose. His face flushed with indignation. "Dr. Finch," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "this is an outrageous fantasy built on circumstantial evidence and wild leaps of logic. You are smearing the name of a great king and a loyal knight based on a few scribbled notes and a misplaced ring." Alistair met his gaze, his own expression unyielding. "Professor," he replied, his voice steady and clear. "I am relying on the evidence, not on the legend. The evidence of a secret pact, the evidence of a pre-planned massacre, the evidence of a guilty conscience. History is not what we wish it had been. It is what the evidence tells us it was." The confrontation was a symbolic clash between the old guard, protectors of the myth, and the determined researcher who had followed the facts, no matter how uncomfortable the conclusion. The aftermath of Alistair's presentation was a firestorm in the quiet world of medieval studies. The Erpingham stratagem became a topic of fierce debate in academic journals, online forums, and documentary specials. Initially, the traditionalists, led by figures like Carlyle, fought back hard, defending the established narrative. But Alistair's evidence was too compelling to be dismissed. Other historians, intrigued by his findings, began their own investigations. A new archaeological survey of the Agincourt battlefield, using Alistair's theory as a guide, found evidence of earthworks consistent with a man-made funnel. A linguistic expert confirmed that the term sparrow was occasional 15th-century slang for an informant. Slowly, grudgingly, the tide began to turn. The historical consensus began to shift, acknowledging the deep flaws in the romantic version of the battle. The story of Agincourt was being rewritten, not as a simple tale of heroism, but as a complex drama of desperation, betrayal, and tactical genius. Months later, Alistair returned to the battlefield. He stood on the same rise, looking out over the now hallowed ground. The wind was the same, the sky was the same, but his understanding of what happened here was irrevocably changed. He no longer saw a miracle. He saw a meticulously designed killing field. He felt a profound sense of somber resolution. He had not set out to tarnish a hero, but to find the truth. In doing so, he had given a voice to the forgotten, to Sire de Launcourt, the desperate traitor, to the thousands of French knights, not just arrogant nobles but men who were led into a slaughterhouse, their chivalric ideals weaponized against them, and even to the English archers, whose legendary skill was a tool in a plan far grimmer than they could have imagined. In a museum in Paris, the de Launcourt signet ring now rests in a small glass case, no longer an anonymous artifact. The description beside it tells a new story, not of a noble who died for France, but of a man caught between two powerful forces, whose desperate choice changed the course of a kingdom. Alistair Finch had solved the mystery of the battle, but in doing so, he had revealed a darker, more resonant truth, that behind every great legend, there lies a human cost, and that history, however deeply buried, eventually finds a way to speak.